China's GDP for the first time surpassed 90 trillion yuan, about $13 trillion in 2018. However, according to figures released by the National Bureau of Statistics, or NBS, on Monday, China's GDP growth registered 6.6% last year, the lowest in 28 years. The head of NBS said during a Monday press conference that the figure was above the official target of around 6.5%, and the economy performed within a reasonable range. But some Western commentators are hyping the slowdown, saying China may hit a new bottom and affect the global economy. Well, they've been doom and gloom about the Chinese economy all along, but are they finally striking the right note? What are the factors behind the softening? How will China adjust its economic policies? Welcome to this special edition of The Point, an opinion show coming to you from Beijing. I'm Lu Xin. Joining me for the discussion are John Gong, Professor of Economics at the University of International Business in the Beijing studio, Blackburn-Dwyer, President of Grasshopper Group Inc. in Philadelphia, Winnie, Director of the China Program at the Eurasian Business Coalition in Washington, D.C., and Daniel Gros, Director of the Center for European Policy Studies in Brussels. Gentlemen, welcome to the show. Now, some of the figures, again, just to give people a clear idea of what we are talking about. $13 trillion in 2018, 6.6% growth rate year on year, the slowest in 28 years. I want to start by asking this question to all of our guests today, and John, I will go to you first. Is China in trouble?
No, I think it's a normal business that the growth rate is going to continue to slide in the long history of scheme of things. I mean, we are the largest second economy in the world. It's a $13 trillion economy. And at a 7%, let's say a 7%, roughly a 7% growth would be something close to $1 trillion GDP created every year. So as the economy becomes larger and larger, of course it's more difficult to get the same pace of growth. So it's natural that the growth is going to slow down. As a matter of fact, in economics, we have something called the convergence theory, which means that advanced economies eventually will all slow down to something like 2 or 3% eventually. So China's clearly marching in that direction. Now, having said that, I have to admit that we are getting into a slow growth these days, particularly with respect to the slowing down of the global macro environment. If you look at the growth rate for quarters last year, it's 6.8% in the first quarter, 6.7% in the second quarter, and then 6.5% in the third quarter, 6.4% in the last quarter. So it's clear that the growth has been coming down and down. So we are heading into a slowdown, no doubt about it. But we're not in trouble, I think.
Okay, Brendan, your take on this question? How do you look at the figures that are obviously registering a downward trend?
Well, first of all, I'd agree with my colleague that generally people shouldn't overreact to the idea that China is going to have a slower growth rate than it has had historically over the last 28 years. Maintaining the old standard of Baja or 8% growth rate is just simply impossible for any economy to grow at that level. You literally have to keep exponential growth, not continual growth, to keep growing at 8%. So let's accept that it has to slow down. Is there a real concern in the short term and the long term? Short term, the concern is how much does it slow down and where does that slowdown really happen? Is it the overall economy for China that slows down, or is the slowdown going to hit manufacturing areas? Is it going to hit provinces in China that are still relying on exponential growth to end poverty, to lift people up to the middle class? If it's really just the macro sense, if we're looking at the major areas that are already relatively more developed and it's consumerism that's slowing a little bit, or it's purchasing from abroad that's slowing a little bit, that's not the problem. The problem China has to be concerned about is, does the growth rate stay in certain provinces high enough to keep people advancing, growing, building their wealth, and entering the middle class? If that happens, we can end up with a world where China grows at 4 or 5% and is pretty happy.
Do you have answers to these questions, though, Brandon? You've asked yourself these questions. Are you seeing any clues that could answer part of it, at least?
So I think the one concerning area is you're seeing a couple of manufacturing bases that have traditionally succeeded by providing cheap goods and cheap labor to the rest of the world on the coastal regions. They're definitely starting to slow down. The businesses that are succeeding are the ones that are transitioning to higher tech, more research and development, more services, a better quality of goods, or they're able to outsource some of their labor to other areas by purchasing supply from other areas. So the ones that are transitioning are succeeding, but they're leaving a lot of people behind. Those companies are either dying or they're moving inland where labor is still cheaper. That's not a long-term sustainable goal. It is good for the inland provinces that have been left behind in some cases over the last 20 years, but it's not going to work because they're going to get a much shorter period of growth because at the end of the day, Chinese labor will still go down faster, it'll still go up in price faster than other countries, so it will be cheaper to offshore some of that. What China really needs to do is they are doing the right thing, short term, reduce the debt.
Okay, we'll go to what China needs to do in just a moment. Let me still get the opening statement from Rolf and Daniel. For instance, Rolf, what is your look at the interpretation of the Chinese economy, how healthy it is that, or is finally, you know, the moment where we say, wow, the Chinese economy is really slowing down. We've actually haven't seen this in the past, right, Rolf?
Sure. I think it's inevitable. China has had extensive growth throughout the years, but it's just inevitable that it would slow down for a couple of quarters. I think it's going to be predicated on what kind of trade deal is going to be able to be negotiated between President Trump and Xi Jinping. We have to see what the end result of a U.S.-China trade deal is going to be in terms of how it's going to affect the growth of the Chinese economy. You also have to look at the amount of money, the stimulus programs that have been enacted in various provinces like Guangxi and Xinjiang to help create jobs and economic development, especially for the minority people, to improve their quality of life and integrate them into the fabric of the Chinese economy. These provinces are crucial in terms of promoting new types of economic development opportunities and to keep people in the provinces so that they don't move into the major cities like Beijing and Shanghai.
Okay, you mentioned the first factor, which is whether or not China and the United States are able to strike a reasonable or successful trade deal. Are you saying that China's slowdown is to some extent attributed to by this trade friction between China and the United States, Rolf?
I think there's a perception, especially in the Trump administration, that the slowdown is part of the fact that there isn't a viable U.S.-China trade deal in place. And the sanctions that have gone into effect on different kinds of products have certainly hurt both U.S. and China. And we're going to have to see again what kind of deal gets formulated. Trump is not a politician or a diplomat. He markets himself as a business person, as a deal maker. And now China has come to the table and offered different ways for the parties to sit down and to create and iron out an actual trade deal. So we'll have to see what happens moving forward. But I certainly do think the more Chinese foreign direct investment that comes into the U.S. is a really boon for both countries. You have China Energy Investment Corporation agreeing to put $250 billion in the U.S., $75 billion of that in West Virginia for shale gas development and chemical manufacturing. You've got Tencent coming into Wisconsin. So the Trump administration wants the Chinese FDI coming into the U.S. to create opportunities. Okay. And now we have to see how that's going to develop in China.
Yeah. Well, Daniel, your take, observing from Europe, the state of health for the Chinese economy at this moment, whether or not that is within people's expectation. By the way, China forecasted that its growth for 2018 would be around 6.5%. So actually, the actual number of 6.6% GDP growth is still above China's expectation, isn't it?
That is true. Of course, people get a little bit suspicious if the quarterly GDP figures are too perfectly aligned. But we all agree that China could not continue to grow at 8 to 10%, so some slowdown is unavoidable and is happening, I think, rather smoothly. I would say the trade deal with the US is really of secondary importance. It might have a cyclical impact on confidence in China, but exports to the US are not the main factor driving the Chinese business cycle. What I'm more concerned about, this is more a long-term concern, is there has been some overinvestment. And building new infrastructure is, of course, always very useful. But if you build the infrastructure today, you don't need to build it tomorrow. And that means that demand might slow down, not right now, but over the next few years, perhaps much quicker than many people realize. And therefore, the slowdown might actually accelerate. But of course, it will not be a recession. China will still continue to grow more than the US or Europe. But the pace will, I think, diminish over the next few years.
Yeah. Well, already we have covered a lot of discussing points. Okay, we're going to touch on this real quickly, the trade friction between China and the United States. Ralph thinks that this is probably one of the most important concerns. John, what is your take on this question? Is that the factor, the major factor behind the slowing down, especially the aligned slowing down of China up till the last quarter?
I think if you look at the numbers, Chinese exports to the U.S. is at about $500 billion. So $500 billion out of $13 billion, it's about 4%, less than 4% of China's economy. So if you just look at the numbers, it's not a big deal. I mean, just a small percentage of the total economy here. But there's a psychological impact here, because the news that our exports are slowing down, and companies along the coast in Zhejiang province, for example, they're laying off people. There are news of other companies laying off people. These are psychological factors that people take into that consideration when they make business decisions and make investment decisions. And from that perspective, it is very important. And of course, our relationship with the U.S. is not just about exports. It's totally intertwined. And corporate America, they're also operating heavily here in China. I mean, representing $500 billion of interest here. And if they're laying off people, for example, the automobile industry is not doing so well this year, and Ford Motor Company, GM are not doing so well. So all these factors will contribute to much larger impact compared to just comparing the sheer numbers. So I think it is very important.
Yeah. Brendan, your take on the same question. How much is the uncertainty that's aroused by the US-China trade friction affecting people's outlook in China's economic prospects? For instance, there are forecasts by Reuters that next year China's economic growth will slow even further by 6.3%.
So I would agree that it's uncertainty rather than the actual numbers involved in trade with the United States. 500 billion, as my colleague has pointed out, is less than 4% of the overall GDP of China. If it was just about the numbers, I wouldn't be that concerned. The problem is that trade, particularly trade with the United States, has been a linchpin of confidence. Confidence externally in the Chinese economy, and even more importantly and crucially, confidence internally. Over the last 28 years, China has really not faced any significant crisis of confidence. Their entrepreneurs don't know how to deal with this kind of uncertainty. Their manufacturing base don't know how to plan for a world where they don't see the United States as a viable consumer, whether that fear is real or not. That fear will lead to bad decisions. That fear will lead to province hopping too soon, will lead to cutbacks in staff, will lead to people already making the decision to shut their factories a week or two before the Chinese New Year because they see a bad outlook, not realizing that for the overall economy, this is just a couple of percentage points of the GDP. If that uncertainty and that fear spreads to other areas, you will see domestic consumption continue to fall. And if there is a real concern for the Chinese economy over the next 6 months, it is that domestic consumption and domestic confidence does not continue to propel the Chinese economy forward.
John, are we seeing two multiple factors playing at the same time? At the same time, the Chinese economy is naturally slowing down, and then the uncertainty or the crisis of confidence as a result of the trade friction with the United States, and then also slower consumption power within the Chinese society. Multiple facts put together that we're seeing this figure we're seeing now.
Absolutely. These things combined together, contribute to the slowdown. And I also want to mention another factor we haven't talked about yet. See, we have been into this boom cycle. I mean, the world economy has been into this boom cycle for such a long time. It's been almost like a decade so far, and we've been continuing to experiencing good times and good times year after year for such a long time. And the business cycle tends to have a life of its own, and people, business communities would expect that there's some bad times coming after having such a long good period of time. And that's also built into the consumer and investor confidence as well.
Yeah, but I think it's a very important fact factor that we, the Chinese, since we entered this reform and opening up, we've had success non-stop, right? Finally, there is this seemingly coming period of slow growth, and people are a little bit at loss. I think that's all the more natural. We're going to take a very short break, and when we come back, we're going to talk about how the Chinese government has decided to react to this natural slowing of the Chinese economy and what that means for businesses and people around the world. Stay with us. Welcome back to the show, and let's continue to talk about the health and the solutions that the Chinese government is coming up to cope with the slowing economic development. John, how much do you think the Chinese government is aware of the scale of the challenge they're faced at this moment, and what is the approach that they have decided to address this problem? Is it closing China? Is it protecting its industry, or is it to open China further and putting Chinese enterprises in front of international competitors?
I think the leaders are very aware of this. I mean, several weeks ago we had this economic conference by the central government. They've already set out the agenda to somehow stimulate the economy. I think the tools they're going to use are very classical tools, fiscal policy as well as monetary policy. Fiscal policy in terms of fast-tracking several very important and very large infrastructure projects, for example, subway projects in major cities, and as well as other projects in terms of monetary policy, been relaxing the reserve requirement for the banks, encouraging them to make more loans. So all these measures are tailored towards stimulating the economy. So I think they're very aware of this. And my hope is that they're doing these things not in an overdoing way, in other words, to stimulate the economy and so as to leave some side effects for the next cycle.
Yeah, well, Daniel just now was talking about overinvestment in infrastructure and stimulus that might be over the top for the moment. But overall, do you think, Daniel, that the Chinese decision or approach to address the issue through reform and opening up is the right approach? And what does that mean for European business and consumers?
Of course, continuing to open up is the right decision, because it was the opening up which started Chinese growth. And of course, European entrepreneurs will very much welcome that. They will also very much welcome the stimulus measures. But if the stimulus is designed to offset something temporary, like uncertainty about the trade deal with China, I think it's appropriate to use especially monetary policy, perhaps a little bit fiscal policy. But if the slowdown is structural, that part, I think the structural part, one should not try to offset with fiscal policy. And therefore the Chinese government must make a very fine choice. As we said earlier, there's the structural part and the conjunctural, the cyclical part. You should use monetary policy for the cyclical part, but the structural part, I think you have to accept.
From what you are seeing, also Daniel, do you see the kind of signal or action or determination, at least on the part of the Chinese government, to address the structural issue through reforms?
Unfortunately, at least from the outside, one sees less reforms. One sees now at least more emphasis on just providing more demand, building more subways, as you said, building more infrastructure, which is all good. But if one wants to keep a high pace of economic growth, then the Chinese economy might have to shift to more knowledge-intensive sectors. And I know that the government has invested very heavily with universities and higher education in general, but these are sectors which really need to be opened up internally and externally. More stricter competition policy, for example, to encourage more new enterprises. These are the things which would be needed right now.
Basically, you're saying maybe the Chinese government has been talking about reform, but actually it has not carried out as its international counterparts wish it to, or it has not carried out the more difficult reforms. John, and let me go to Brandon, or let me go to Ralph. Ralph has been waiting and listening for a while. Ralph, what is your take on the seriousness of this question, whether you see it in the same way observing from the United States, and also working for Eurasian Business Coalition?
You're right. I think one of the challenges that companies have when they're in China, and we hear it on the ground because we have an office in Shanghai, is the inability to transfer money, out of the country once they've set up an established business, and things can be very bureaucratic at times, and so that's always a challenge when you're actually on the ground helping clients to do effective business in the country. Now, I think the Silk Road Initiative, we haven't really touched on that, but I think that that is a way for China to help grow and expand their economy, linking East versus West. I mean, there's been a lot of money put into, as we said, infrastructure, but also port development, security, and the ability to exert a form of soft diplomacy to engage with their neighbors in Central Asia, that I think will pay enormous dividends over time. But certainly in the short run, you have to look at a slowdown in growth. But I do think over time, as China takes a more active role in the Silk Road Initiative, it's going to pay enormous dividends for the growth of their economy.
Yeah, a lot of expectations. I see a lot of aspirations from international counterparts on the part of China. John, your reaction to what Daniel was talking about there? The European concern that maybe reforms are not as deep as they should be?
Well, first of all, I want to say that the reforms are taking place. For example, we have had the SOE reforms. We've been keep opening markets, especially the financial market. We have also, relaxed market access in a couple of industries. Tesla's just set up its 100% wholly owned subsidiary company here in Shanghai, right? So, these are all events that testify to China's continued opening up and as well as reform. So I think it is taking place. It's not going back. But of course, if you ask the question whether it's fast enough, the pace is satisfactory to the foreign investors, that may be an issue here. So I think we have to look at two sides of this coin. Now, regarding this question about the difficulty of transferring money out of China, in my opinion, it's probably temporary. I think the company referred to, or the organization referred to, probably experiencing some difficulties during a time when China's foreign exchange reserve was rapidly declining, from $4 trillion down to $3 trillion. And during that time, I know that the central government has taken some measures, essentially intensifying the procedures, making things a little bit more difficult, I guess, to doing the paperwork for transfer money out of the country. But I think as long as these usages for these funds are legitimate and also complying with the legal requirements, I think it should be okay for money transferred in and out of the country.
Yeah, that's a more specific question here. Right. But really, Brandon, what is the scale of things for China when we are talking about reform? Let's not forget we're talking about a $13 trillion economy. We're talking about 1.4 billion country. I don't want to sound apologetic for the Chinese government, but really how difficult it is to change things. And I think the Chinese government has said on various occasions, have announced reform measures, and they have actually started to implement them, and on a rather fast pace. Brandon, what is your take at the situation? Of course, they're never going to satisfy the demands of foreign businesses as fast as they raise these demands.
Right. No, let's overall, I agree with almost everything that's been said. I know that's really rare, but in economics, you can agree with everything and everything can be wrong. I agree that from a foreigner's perspective, we're concerned about getting money out of China. We're concerned about foreign direct investment. We're concerned about opening up. We applaud the Silk Road Initiative. We applaud lowering trade tariffs. We applaud a deal from the trade between the United States and China. We're concerned about IP. But here's the real challenge for China. Let's forget the rest of the world here.
We only come to the real challenge now. Wow.
They are making a version. Yeah, they are going through a version of what Japan went through in the 80s, what the United States went through in the 80s and 90s, and that's going to start with communications to fix it. President, or then candidate, Clinton, when he was running for president in 1992, went around the country and told manufacturers their employees needed to go back to school because they would no longer be able to have simple blue-collar jobs. They would have to have mixed jobs with higher skills, with more computers, with more technology. China is going to have to do the same thing. It will slow short-term economic growth. It will cause certain companies to go under. It will cause a certain amount of turnover and people to lose jobs. The government and the country needs to communicate and say, look, it's bad, that's not great. On an individual basis, there will be pain. But on a macro basis, we need to make this transition to have long-term growth. While we make that transition, China is already focusing on one of the other sort of time bombs in its economy, which is the amount of debt. Debt since 2009 has gone from 18% of GDP to over 50% of GDP. That needs to be paid back. They need to unwind that debt so that in a couple years, if there is an actual real problem, if there is a real, not just a slowdown, but a hard landing, they have more tools to create stimulus.
Okay, I think Brandon touched upon some very important issues. First of all, communication within your own people. Explain to them what is happening, prepare them for the future. And also, you talk about a very important issue, which is the debt, and you talk about 40%. John, you're going to tell us whether that number is correct. But yeah, tell us about the importance of communication.
My impression, well, first of all, about this debt issue, my impression is that debt level is probably more than 40% of the China's GDP right now.
Okay.
But I
more
think
than 50%.
Yeah, but I think
more than 50%.
Well, even that is not a big deal. Even now, it's not a big deal. I think if you look at the actually, Wikipedia has a web page that lists all the countries in the world that ranked in the order of the national debt as percentage of GDP. China ranks very, very low on their list. The top countries, Japan, United States, is way up there. You know, so in terms of the total debt as percentage of GDP, it's way, way low. You know, it's not a big deal. I'm not concerned about that at all. About the communication, I think Brandon is right on this. I think you know, our government does a very, and I don't think it's a very good job in terms of communicating with the people, in terms of at least conveying this message in a benign way that all people have to pitch in and you know, and go through short-term pain.
And I think they're telling people in their usual style of language that there are things to be worried about, which is unprecedented for the Chinese official narrative. You never hear them say the word worrisome unless it is really worrisome. But I want to ask the last question to Rolf in DC. You know, China could have said, okay, our jobs are being lost to cheaper labor countries such as Vietnam or Bangladesh. We're going to blame them. We're going to impose tariffs on them. You know, what the United States is doing to China. But China decided to say, we open our door, we reform, and let more competition come in. How do you look at that contrast between the Chinese way of addressing this problem and Donald Trump's?
Well, I think that's a very positive approach to take, and it shows that the Chinese are willing to engage and negotiate in a very constructive way. So we'll just have to see what the administration comes back with. I think the administration has taken the position that we are in negotiations, we're not in a trade war. So I appreciate that perspective from the Trump administration.
Okay.
Now we just have to get the parties together and hammer out an effective deal.
Okay. Time to go. Interesting conversation, but no time left. Many thanks to John Gong, Professor of Economics at the University of International Business in the Beijing studio, Brandon Blackburn-Dwyer, President of Grasshopper Group Inc, Rolf Winnie, Director of the China Program at the Eurasian Business Coalition, and Daniel Gros, Director of the Center for European Policy Studies in Brussels. And that's it for this edition of The Point with me, Liu Xin. As always, you're going to follow me on Facebook and Twitter using the handle The Point with LX. Download the application called CGTN to watch the show on your mobile devices, or go to YouTube and look for CGTN The Point. Thanks for watching. You've got The Point.